Humanities, Episode 1, First Civilizations. The first civilizations cover a vast amount of time, over 25,000 years, and given the scope of humanities, it will be impossible to cover it all, and as a result, the lecture may feel a bit disjointed at times, but here it goes. One of the things that defines the humanities is a search for our nature. How did we get here? What purpose do we serve? What happens when this life is over? Religion is the first attempt to try to answer these questions, but as we'll see, it continues to be the dominant go-to on these questions all throughout history. For many, it's surprising and interesting to note that the earliest deities were female, and the earliest societies were matriarchal. Within the ancient world, the great goddess flourished under many names: Astarte, Inan, Inanna, Nana, Nut, Anut, Anahita, Ishtar, Isis, Anset, Ishara, Asherah, Ashtart, Atoret, Attar, and Hathor, just to name a few from Egypt and the Middle East. Many more names can be found all around the world. The great goddess, or the mother goddess, thrived for thousands of years before the rise of Yahweh and monotheism. According to notable anthropologists such as Margaret Mead and Jacquetta Hawkes and James Fraser, the reason for this has to do with biology, or more specifically, a lack of understanding of biology. In early societies, the act of sexual coupling as a source of producing children was not properly understood, and as a result, the male was not seen as relevant to the process. The child simply began to grow within some women, and women had children, they brought life, and that was something very powerful. In these early societies, the children would take their names from their mother's tribe, and they would follow their ancestry through their mother's line. In addition, women learned to cultivate the earth, which meant that they were responsible for bringing forth the food to feed the tribes. Through this cultivation and food production, women made the earth valuable, and they took possession of it. Women are the economic and social power of the ancient world. The earliest religious traditions, looking back more than 25,000 years, were a form of ancestor worship. People could understand that they were brought into existence by their mothers, who was brought into existence by their mothers, and so on. But where did this all begin? Even the primitive mind knew that there couldn't be an infinite regression. It couldn't just keep going on and on and on. There had to be a first cause, a first mother. And this was the mother goddess. This was the supreme deity. Now, many depictions have been found, but the earliest seems to be the goddess of Willendorf, which was created almost 30,000 years ago. You can notice from looking at it, it's a very small statue in size, but it is designed to represent that idea of motherhood, right? You see the enlarged breasts for producing of milk. You see the enlarged stomach representing the idea of the child being in the womb. And so this idea of motherhood becomes the dominant trend. This is what brings us forward, and that's what it's trying to represent. Around 6000 BCE, some of these goddesses would get a son, a brother, a lover, or a consort that entered into the story. And this is the birth of the masculine aspect of the deity, at least 25,000 years after the birth of the feminine aspect. We're told that Judaism, which is considered the first monotheistic faith, began about 5,000 years ago. But that isn't quite true, because early Judaism was part of a polytheistic society. El, Asherah, Baal, Anat, and many others were worshipped within Canaanite society. El gave way to Yahweh, who along with Asherah represented the male and the female aspect of God in that religion. Asherah, the female aspect of God, was revered. In the temple, the Asherah tree stood beside the altar as a reminder that God is both masculine and feminine in nature. Starting around the 9th century BCE, things began to change. It's recorded that between 928 and 586, when the temple was destroyed, that the Asherah was removed and restored to the temple no less than 4 times. Rehoboam begins by putting it in there, and then somebody else comes around and takes it out again. Somebody else puts it in, somebody else takes it out. The Asherah was removed and restored no less than 4 times. A battle had begun to make Yahweh the sole deity and to vilify and erase Asherah. Her statues would be destroyed, her worship would be forbidden as idolatry, and as Asherah left the temple, so too did the authority of women. The role and the status of women in society suffered greatly as the one true God, the masculine deity, established monotheism. You can notice from the image that's being seen here on this relief, right, there is Asherah, but the face has been completely removed. And so the idea of erasure culture is nothing new. It has been around for a very long time. Within these ancient societies, the earth itself is also going to be perceived as the mother, as that which gives life to all of us. It provides a place for us to live. It provides food and shelter. It provides for our basic needs. By contrast, the sky comes to be seen as the father. It's distant. It's still a provider. It brings rains. It gives us water to drink. It helps the crops to grow. But also, the father is the disciplinarian. He can punish us by withholding the rains. He can punish us by bringing them on torrentially. And so the mother and the father, just as in that earthly sense, work together symbiotically. The mother earth, the father sky. Early humans recognized this, and they began to envision sacred sites that would link the earth and the sky together, recognizing them as that unity that is working as one. Academics call this concept the axis mundi. According to the axis mundi, structures that are rooted into the earth also reach towards the sky, and the ground level where one congregates is the union of the two. We see this notion much more strongly in later society, churches, temples, stupas, and so on, and we'll examine it again later in this series. But it's still present in early primitive societies. If you look at the image of the stupa over here, this is a Buddhist structure, and you'll notice that, of course, like any building, it's going to be dug into the ground. There's going to be a foundation upon which it's built. It rises very high and it goes to the sky. It's trying to touch the sky, and so it links the earth and the sky together. As you ascend the stairs and go inside through that door, you would find yourself sort of in the center, joining or connecting those two. You would become part of that experience. In Australia, Ayers Rock is a natural outcropping, but again, that rock is going to go very deep down into the earth itself, down into the ground. It rises up towards the sky, and while you can't necessarily go into it, ceremonies could be conducted around it or at its surface, which again would be something that would link those two elements. But one of the most interesting examples is what's known as the West Kennet Long Barrow. The West Kennet Long Barrow was built in Avebury, England around 3600 BCE. It was built as a tomb and a place of worship. There are chambers and passages dug into the ground with a mound on top. So you can see an image of it here. Unlike some of these other places, it doesn't raise tremendously high towards the sky, but yet you can see that it is attached to the ground. As you go in through the cave, it does go downwards. You're kind of going into the earth, and there is still that element that raises it upwards, and so there is still the axis mundi concept even within it. The inner chambers, which run along through here, the inner chambers represent the womb. During ceremonies, we could enter into the womb to be spiritually nurtured and then emerge from the womb newborn. 50 people were buried at West Kennet. And that raises an interesting question. Did this imply that these early peoples had a belief in an afterlife where the dead would be born again from the womb? Because if our religious practice is supposed to be a way of preparing us for what comes beyond, then the idea of entering into that womb, conducting those ceremonies, being spiritually purified, and then being reborn as new individuals in its emergence, would that not imply sort of a reincarnation aspect of mentality, whereby these individuals who are buried within would be able to take whatever spiritual nourishment was necessary, but then go on to be reborn from the womb? Well, without written records of their beliefs, it's really very difficult for us to say. We really don't know for sure. Anthropologists, they can speculate. It seems reasonable, but we can't say for sure. The West Kennet Long Barrow is unique in its elongated shape, but there are burial mounds like this that are found all over the world, including in the New World, which suggests that there is a common ancestral belief, and probably one that does accept the idea of there being a life after death, or perhaps some form of reincarnation. The Egyptians, of course, take things to a whole new level with the construction of pyramids rising over the tomb of the dead. Despite the grand structure, the same concept remains. The base is linked to the earth. The apex is reaching to the sky. The burial between them is a divine embrace. Now, unlike the earlier structures, though, we're able to understand the Egyptian beliefs a little bit more than we do those earlier ones, because of the advent of writing. Writing is a crucial development in human history, which probably first developed in the Sumerian culture somewhere around 3500 BCE. It seems to have begun as a way of keeping track of inventory and accounts, perhaps earlier than 5000 BCE. But it evolved into a form of pictographs that we call cuneiform. And so the image on the side here represents the idea of cuneiform, these little symbols that have representative meaning. Shortly after this, the Egyptians developed their own system of writing, which they call hieroglyphics. Most people are probably familiar with that, but again, you can see them in the image there. Because of the advent of writing, the human story begins to get clearer, probably about 5,000 years ago. The Egyptians can lay out their beliefs and their practices. And in fact, we have a work called the Book of the Dead, or the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which does just this. Now, of course, the name Book of the Dead is a modern creation. Originally, it was a collection of varied papyrus scrolls that were used to help the dead on their journey towards the afterlife and through the afterlife. But for anthropologists, of course, and archaeologists, it's an invaluable collection for trying to help understand the ancient Egyptian beliefs and trying to figure out what exactly they entail. Writing allowed myths and legends, which had long been passed down orally, to be preserved for future generations. The earliest surviving epic is known as the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a Sumerian tale about Gilgamesh, a great warrior king of the city of Uruk. and he lived roughly about 2600 BCE. Gilgamesh is likely the first archetype of an epic hero, the first time that we have an actual example of what we refer to as an epic hero coming into play. Now, it's interesting in this story that we get also an insight into early philosophy. We don't tend to think of philosophy too much prior to the ancient Greeks, but in reality, philosophy has been around, these thoughts, these ideas, as long as human beings have. And so this very early work sort of gives us some insight into basic early philosophy. Because Gilgamesh is going to be very distraught when his companion Enkidu is killed. Now, in the beginning of Gilgamesh, he was this great leader, he was this great warrior, and he was quite pleased with the idea that he had done such great deeds that his name would live on forever. But when Enkidu dies, he comes to believe that that isn't good enough. He wants real immortality. He wants to live forever. And that's a vision that so many people in the world have aimed towards. You know, we get all kinds of stories coming down to us. The Fountain of Youth, Ponce de Leon, that's a common story that we hear. Or even modern tales like Dracula are an opportunity for individuals to reach out and try to touch that sense of immortality. So, like many people in history, Gilgamesh wants true immortality. He wants to live forever. And so he goes on this perilous journey, right, the hero's journey, to try to find it. But in the end, he will discover that what he seeks is impossible. The one universal constant, the one absolute truth, is that everyone must die. If a thing is brought into existence, it will go out of existence. If a person is born, that person will die. And that is the one universal truth. Death is inevitable. Though Gilgamesh doesn't take us to this point, we come to realize later on, of course, that this is actually a good thing. Because if we had true immortality, we would become complacent, we would become stagnant. It's only the fact that we know we have a limited lifespan that propels us forward to create, that propels us forward to try to make something of ourselves, of our life, to make things better. We achieve only because of that knowledge of death. And so, much like Derrida would say thousands of years later in the 20th century, death is a great gift. Now watch for this theme to keep emerging within the humanities, because it does. It shows up over and over again. Another fascinating aspect of the Epic of Gilgamesh is its telling of the Great Flood. The flood is something that's found in many traditions. The Sumerians themselves have 3 stories that relate it. Of course, there's the story in Genesis, but all over the world there are flood myths. Were all of these myths derived from the same world catastrophe? In other words, was there a great universal flood that took place, and all over the world individuals knew of it and spoke on it and wrote of it, and is that why it's found in so many places? Or have other cultures simply recognized the value of this story? A story that talks about why individuals should act morally and be good, why individuals should follow rules, because if they don't, God or the gods will come and destroy them and begin the world anew. If cultures perhaps recognized that there was value within a story like that, they could have simply borrowed from each other to try to promote these ideas. Again, all anthropologists can do is to speculate on this issue, but it does seem reasonable to believe that maybe there was that sense of recognizing its value from one place to the next to the next. We have not found evidence of a great flood. There are localized floods, and maybe it is possible that the flood that Gilgamesh is dealing with is the flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, but in another part of the world there's other rivers that were flooded. We simply don't know. But it's, again, fascinating to speculate and to recognize these similar stories showing up time and time again throughout our history. Writing also allowed for the religious teachings of many societies to be recorded beyond that of the Sumerians or the Egyptians. The Vedic cultures, the Vedic societies of India were able to preserve and write down their thoughts and their ideas. The Chinese will develop a writing system that allows them to do so as well. Now, to prevent this talk from getting too long, and because I've already discussed Vedic beliefs in great depth and detail elsewhere, I'm going to stop the lecture at this point and direct those of you interested in delving further to watch my videos on the Moral World YouTube channel, which you see the link to it up there. There are three that I would recommend. Most prominently, Sanatan Dharma. The video Sanatan Dharma is a single lecture that gives a very nice overview of Vedic thought, Vedic beliefs, and I would very much encourage you to watch that one. But if you wanted to go into greater depth, into greater detail in your study of Vedic philosophies, then I also have two multi-part series on there. One is examining the ancient Indian epic known as the Ramayana, one of the most ancient epics of the world, a little more recent than the Epic of Gilgamesh, but still one of the earliest epics of the world. It is a tale that is so prominent that it's still speaking volumes to people in Vedic society today. Not too long ago, Indian television made a miniseries of the Ramayana that became the highest rated series in all of Indian television history. So it's still something that's recognized as very important, very prominent within that culture. The other series is called Understanding the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is in many ways the Bible of the Vedic people. And this lecture series, Understanding the Bhagavad Gita, does go into great depth in helping you to understand that. So those are available to you. I recognize the multi-part series may not fit into your schedule now, but if you have an interest, I would encourage you to remember it and go back and look at it at some point in the future when you have more time. But I would encourage you to take a look at the Sanatan Dharma lecture, just simply, again, to get a basic overview of Vedic thoughts and Vedic ideas.